I did qualify as a clinical hypnotherapist back in the day. The main reason for that actually was because I was working in schools at the time. And what I realised is that there are young people in schools who are excellent when they're learning something and in kind of lessons. Then they go to an exam and they can't replicate the brilliance that they've got in the classroom in the exam. And I realised that this is something to do with mindset, right? You know, it's the kind of the tunnel vision that the athletes talk about when it really comes to that moment, kind of get in the zone and do it. And I thought, is there a way of learning about this? And it turns out that some of the work that happens behind the scenes in clinical hypnotherapy is relevant. Neurolinguistic programming, there's a lot in that kind of space as well. And a lot of this is also relevant to the business world as well. You know, we all, in a project context, this is the one that we really need to pull out the bag and make it work. Well, there's a couple of things. I think one of my impressions of the project profession, which makes it distinct to probably almost every other profession, is that it's all about solving the problem. Everybody else is kind of articulating the problem and framing the problem and so on. But actually, we're the people who actually think up the solutions and deliver the solutions. And I think education in general is a bit like that. You know, we've got these young, bright young minds, if you like, and we've got to turn them into these people that are able to go out into the world and make a valuable contribution. And that's not the same now as it was 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. So it's constantly kind of reinventing itself. So I think that's something they've got in common. The second thing for me, and this is probably the bigger thing, is this point around kind of societal benefit. It's the thing that APM really hangs its hat on. You know, we have that expression because when projects succeed, society benefits. Everybody I meet who's in education and everybody I meet who's in projects, they're in it for kind of the same reason. They want to make the world a better place. In projects, I think it will reach that point. I think the question is, will the profession be ready for it when it reaches? Because the reality is, you have these different generations, right, who are coming through. And there was the generation that grew up with computers, you know, the generation that grew up with smartphones. This generation now, is this the generation that grew up with AI and learned it's just native, right? That's just that's just normal. So when they are kind of the dominant majority of the workforce, that for me is when it will change anyway. And the question is, will the profession, will the wider business world be ready for it when that time comes? I just make one other observation as well, which is that if you look at other technological innovations, the workforce has generally been ahead of the curve. You know, you think when laptops came in, when Microsoft Office started, or some people learned about that stuff or used that technology in the workplace first, and then they thought, well, I could also use that in my personal life in some way. It's the opposite. The nervousness of business. You've got all of these individuals who are trying stuff out at home and stuff like that, but, you know, they're not allowed to try stuff in the workplace because of all of the, you know, fears and anxieties. And so when businesses do eventually take the plunge, they're not starting from a steady state where they can control that. They can have all of these different people with different ideas and different levels of familiarity and comfort, if you like, with the technology. And that's going to make it even harder. I know all the theory on this, and we've got to revisit the business case and update, you know. But the truth is, I come back to this unintended benefits piece as well. So there's all this other stuff that happens. So I honestly think you have to take that long view, and it's that decision about would I reinvest that I think is the important one. I think as well there's the underlying point here around certainty that underpins some of this. So, you know, you take a board, or, you know, it could be a government that's about to invest in a multi-billion-pound project over, you know, decades and so on. There's these two tensions, right? There's a tension of, well, I want to know exactly how much this is going to cost me, and I know exactly what the outcomes are. And you can do that, but then the cost will be higher, right? Because in order to lock everything down, you've got to factor in so much variability and all the things that happen. It costs a fortune. And governments, of course, don't want to do that because they say, well, it's all about value for money, right? We're going to get value for money. But then with that, and to get the value that they're talking about, that requires innovation. It requires risk. It requires probably using technology that doesn't exist at the moment, probably with these kind of multi-decade problems. So that brings with it a kind of known uncertainty at the outset. But what happens is the people that make that decision, if they make that trade and go, we're going to go for value for money and innovation and all that stuff from the beginning, they're not the people in 10 years who are in front of you know, some kind of select committee trying to justify why it's gone billions over billions. So there's a disconnect between what's happening over time about why certain decisions have been made. That's also a part of the challenge. This use of AI is a kind of critical friend almost. I have seen that happening, but I think it's almost happening in a covert rather than overt way. Because, you know, can you imagine me turning up to my, you know, meeting with my project sponsor and saying, you know, me and the AI have had a chat with this, and this is what it doesn't quite play as well as, let me show you my piece of work. I'm not going to lie about the fact that I've used AI, necessarily put that up front. But there's this kind of ethical kind of question underneath. And that's because there's an uncertainty about how that might be received. And I do think that, I talked before we came on air today, I was talking about the APM salary survey. And one of the findings in that, which is quite interesting, is that when they look at the kind of adoption of AI, the early career folk are using it a lot more than the senior folk in businesses. And the confidence, the anticipation, if you like, about the impact that AI will have is much lower at the executive end than it is at the kind of lower end in the workforce. We know this already, but I think it's really prominent in this year's data. And so that's why I think they would be uncertain in that situation of kind of almost admitting that they've used that as a tool, even if it was allowed. As someone who's in a leadership position myself, and as we're talking, I'm reflecting on, organisationally, are we going far enough, ourselves and so on. And I'm struck by one of the challenges is, even if the leadership team, there is kind of broad buy-in at a senior level, at board level and so on, you've kind of got to bring the whole organisation with you. And I see this in the profession, and with APM as the kind of professional body, you've got a really long tail of positions where people are. You've got the evangelists at one end who are about, 10 years ahead of everybody else. And there's not many of them, I have to say. And then I think you've got this long tail of people, mostly, I would say, who have an appetite, who want to learn. And then there's the kind of naysayers at the other end, if you remember Baddiel and Skinner when they used to run their Friday night, so there's all of that at the other end. So you've got everybody in between. And as a profession, it's trying to know, where do you pitch it, right? So do you pitch it at the people with the appetite on the basis that, the naysayers will never look at it anyway and the evangelists don't need it, so we'll just pitch it there? Or is that not enough? Because actually we've got to bring the whole profession with us. And that's the kind of constant question we're asking ourselves is, where do we pitch our resources? Where do we pitch our help, our support, our effort to move the profession itself forward? There is an interest network around AI. So anybody who's out there who is currently an APM member, for example, might be interested in getting involved in that interest network, because that's where they can keep up with the latest information about what we are doing in this space. But the advisory group and the working group have come up with some really interesting kind of assets which are freely available out there. So some of that's around data analytics, not just AI. And as we've kind of referenced today, those things are obviously quite closely connected. Yeah. You can't really do one without the other.
Exactly.
So we've got some stuff around actually really understanding what we're actually talking about. So a kind of getting started guide. It's a live question that we're talking about, and not just the coding side of things. There's lots of other aspects which you could have, replaced coding with in the net you've asked. If I come back to what I said before, we're not a software house. We're also not a kind of, coding training company either. So I don't think it's our role to be doing that. But it is our role to be able to say whether coding as a skill is relevant to being a really effective project professional, and flagging that up if that's the case. And sometimes it's not just about being able to code. It might be being able to understand why coding is helpful in project delivery.